Hey everyone, good afternoon. While we still have some people coming into the webinar, I'd like just to kick things off just so we can stay in line here with our timing. We'll leave the poll open right now. I think most people have filled out the poll that's up. We still just have a few more, so I'll leave that going just for a few more minutes. So welcome to this webinar on forest ecology, management, and carbon in New York State's forests. This webinar is part of a series of three. We have two additional ones coming up. So this is our first webinar of that series to introduce this topic, and we hope that you join us for the additional two to follow along with forest carbon. My name's Tracy, and I'm joining from CCE Columbia Green, where I work as a program manager. Also on this webinar is Shane Stevens. He'll be providing some support through the Q&A and the hand raising feature. And just some quick housekeeping. I believe we have the chat disabled, so please look to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen if you have a question or would like to make a comment. And throughout the presentation, I am happy to stop and take questions as they arise. I would rather discuss those topics while we're in them if we can. So raise your hand, and Shane is going to keep an eye out on those hand raisings and the Q&A so we can try to, in real time, talk to you all and engage with you and answer your questions as best as we can. So Shane and I both work with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene counties, where we do a number of things, mainly all centered around education and outreach for the two counties we serve. Shane and I are a part of the natural resource team, which is where our focus lies. And at our center, we are also home to the Agroforestry Resource Center, which was developed in 2003 as a response to a survey to try and meet the needs of our local forested landowners. Within our facility, we also have this amazing resource, the Sayusla Model Forest, which is a 142-acre demonstration forest that's also part of the New York City's watershed model forest system. So we are one of 4 areas throughout the New York City watershed that demonstrates in real life issues, topics, interests that other landowners engage in. So we aim to be a place where you can come learn and experience and hopefully bring back some tips and techniques to your own property. This webinar series is being offered in partnership with the Nature Conservancy. We have Brittany Wenke on as well, and maybe we'll have some discussions with her later on or throughout the presentation. But just to highlight their incredible work, their mission is to conserve the lands and waters upon which all life depends. They were founded back in the 50s, and in New York State, they have 127 preserves and over 660,000 acres of conserved land. Their goals center around the conservation of that land, protecting rivers and streams, and supporting the people who steward those places and depend on them. So as I mentioned, this is a series of 3 webinars, really all around forest carbon. The focus of today is forest ecology and forest management as it relates to carbon. So thinking about forest ecology in the ways that maybe some of you are familiar with, but with an eye for carbon. And so we'll talk about some ecologically responsible ways to enhance, maintain, or improve your forested land with that eye for carbon, and ways that you can, as a landowner, develop goals to manage your property that serve you and the ecosystem around you. And so just to provide some context before we dive in here, it's official, 2023 was the warmest year on record. At the bottom of this slide here, you'll see a graph showing average temperatures since 1976. And you'll see that steady average increasing and also indicating that it's been 47 years since we've had a colder than average year. So those trends are that the the annual temperatures are rising. And on average in 2023, we're seeing a 2 degree Fahrenheit increase. When you look to the map, you'll notice the darker red areas, they'll indicate more extreme temperature increases, while the poles, mainly the poles of the Earth, are showing some blue spots, which indicate colder temperatures. You'll notice that the map is much more red than it is blue. So when we're talking about this 2 degree Fahrenheit increase, we're talking about an average of all those temperatures. And while 2 degrees might not seem like a lot, recognizing that this is an average with some colder and some warmer areas, you might assume that some areas are experiencing much higher increases in temperature than 2 degrees Fahrenheit, which is how we come to that average. So globally, these are the trends that we're seeing. And something that helps me think about this is I like to consider weather versus climate, right? So we talk about global warming and we talk about climate change, but on any given day, you might feel like, oh, this is a normal day, or this is a really extreme day. And so when we talk about weather, that's what happens on a daily basis. That's what we experience, throughout our days, our weeks, our lives, but that climate is the trend of that weather over time. So this graph really helps to illustrate that those trends are showing a clear increase in temperature. And those temperature increases are coming from the greenhouse effect. I'm sure this isn't the first time you've heard of it, but this is a simplified graph just showing how carbon dioxide is being retained in our atmosphere, and it's causing a negative feedback loop where the sun is putting out solar radiation, and that heat is being cycled in our atmosphere instead of escaping it in a way that it used to. So that's what we're left with, are these increased temperatures that we have to learn how to either mitigate or adapt to. And forests and trees specifically play a really important role. Let's bring it back to maybe 5th grade science and just talk briefly about photosynthesis. We all know it, we've heard the word, but when you look at this graph, you can sort of see it in action. So when our trees, our plants, any vegetation is growing, it's pulling in energy from sunlight and carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. So it's pulling that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere into the tree and engaging with that energy that comes in from the sun. Luckily for us, a byproduct of that is oxygen. So that's pulled off that carbon molecule and kicked back out for us to breathe. But that carbon stays locked up in different forms of the plants and their growth. So in trees, it's locked up in the wood, in the trunks, in the branches, in the leaves, in the root systems, and captured in the soil as well. On average, trees are about 50% carbon. And when you think about that carbon being stored in trees, it can be locked up permanently in the terms of wood products. And so the more healthy a tree is, the more healthy a forested landscape is, the more carbon they absorb. And we'll hope to drive home that point throughout the course of this webinar. And so I mentioned briefly these two terms, mitigation and adaptation. You might have heard these before. They're pretty common phrases that we use around climate change work. And so just to simplify that, mitigation means to reduce the greenhouse emissions to prevent continued change from happening. And adaptation is just simply adjusting to those changes that we're faced with in the current and trying to plan to adjust to future effects. Here's a nice graph that I found. You might notice it is a West Coast graph. You'll see the salmon in the middle, but this is highlighting roles that forests can play in both mitigation and adaptation, and being really intentional about how we source our wood so it's in a sustainable way, that we're leaving our forests intact and healthy and functioning, and permanently locking up carbon potentially in products. So a little more specifically, here are how our forests really help us to both adapt and mitigate. So through mitigation, they are storing carbon. As CO2 emissions go out into the atmosphere, trees are pulling in that carbon, they're sequestering it, and they're locking it up in storage, which is helping to mitigate. They also help us to reduce our energy use through the temperature regulations that they provide. On a hot, sunny day, if you've ever stepped out of a field and into the woods, on average, that temperature difference is about 10 degrees. If you stand under a tree, you'll feel that 10-degree difference in a day. So the more forests we have, the more they're helping to maintain those temperatures instead of causing extremes. Through their natural processes, they also help reduce pollutants and they add oxygen. Thinking about adaptation, about how forests help us make those shifts, again, that temperature regulation is so important, helping to balance out what's happening in the atmosphere. They also help us to adapt by regulating rainfall patterns. And with that, in the forest, they're holding the forest floor together, so they prevent erosion, and that system also provides us with clean water. And I'd like to just ask, if participants are comfortable raising their hand or just adding something to the Q&A. I would love to hear what comes to mind when you think about adaptation and mitigation. So let's start with mitigation. Beyond forests, can people think of examples of how we might engage in mitigation strategies to help reduce the impacts that we're seeing from climate change? Anybody brave enough? I'll give just a few more seconds.
While we wait there, we did have a comment from Frida. I
Sure.
think, yeah, I don't know if you see this on yours. I think it is not accurate to include leaves in the list of locking up, as all leaves, even coniferous, will cycle back to CO2 release within a short time as they decay.
Yeah, thanks for that, Frida. Yeah, locking up is more accurate when you think about those woody parts of the tree. But all of the tree does have that potential to decompose and enter back into the atmosphere or decompose and enter into the soil. I did hesitate when I was bringing up leaves, but I couldn't help but say them because they are such a large volume of the tree's mass, and the leaves do have carbon in them. And so the hope is when those leaves fall to the forest floor, they're adding to the decomposed matter, that duft layer, and creating more carbon in the soil. But you're totally accurate, Frida, as those decomposition processes happen, some of that carbon is released back up into the atmosphere. So I'll just call out a few other mitigation strategies. So those could include things like, oh, someone's coming up with some in the Q&A here. I'm going to read them out. Planting more, restoring existing forests, could be one way to balance the excess carbon we're producing. And then there was a question, do we have any stats on how many acres of forest could reduce excess atmospheric carbon by any amount? We do have some maps coming up later in the slide that show the existing amount of carbon that exists in our forested landscape, but I'll have to look into that. That's an interesting question in terms of how many more acres of forest we might need to reduce excess carbon dioxide. It is making me think of a research project. I'm forgetting his name, but there's a researcher at Cornell, and he was looking at calculating how much volume of biomass would need to be collected, dug, and put into the ground to get at the same point, reducing excess carbon in the atmosphere. I'll try to look at that, and we will be providing follow-up with all the participants who registered and are on today. So you'll get the presentation and any follow-up resources we might discuss or find as a need throughout. But yes, back to the mitigation. Um, so, absolutely planting more trees. Planting more trees is also, it helps us mitigate, but it's also an adaptation strategy as well. So you got a 2-for-1 there. Other mitigation strategies might include improving your energy efficiency, using renewable energies, and another mitigation strategy is actually taxing fossil fuels and CO2 emissions. Some more adaptation strategies would be absolutely grow more forests and thinking about our infrastructure and facilities, so building more sustainable infrastructure and securing our facilities. Okay.
Tracy, we have another comment. What comes to mind as people talk of adaptation and mitigation, the first thing I think of is why are we not talking about population reduction? More people, more manufacturing, more forests converted to food production, less possibility of lowering carbon in the atmosphere.
Thanks for that, Frida. That is certainly something that we could discuss, but we are going to just be sticking with forests today. I appreciate, where you're coming from, and certainly more people do result in more carbon emissions. But that is not in my control. What is in my control is just to share this information with you that hopefully you can put into practice. So beyond forests helping us mitigate and adapt to climate change, we know that forests provide a whole host of other benefits that just can't be ignored. So, just to call out a few, they filter water and help retain water so we have access to it. They provide space for us to recreate, to hike, to bike. They provide habitat for all of these incredible users of the forest, the flora and the fauna. And they also help us engage with our economy in the form of wood products. And there's many more. So even though forests help us in all these ways, including with climate change adaptation and mitigation, we have to recognize that they're impacted too. They experience things like natural disturbances, shifts from storms, wildfires, or pest outbreak. They'll be reduced in their carbon storage because their growth will be reduced through damage or degraded soils, perhaps as a result of past management. Water resources are impacted as well. While they do help us buffer this by retaining water, if we're in an extreme drought or in a flood, forests can be damaged by those impacts. Reduced snowpack is a huge one as well. We're here in New York State, and I don't know about you guys, but I was really missing the snow last winter. We did not have many storms, and we did not have consistent snow cover on the ground throughout the entire winter, which is something we have not consistently seen in a few years now. And that's really crucial. Our forests really depend, specific trees really depend on that snowpack to provide insulation and buffers from the extreme weather. And to have this soaking in the spring, this annual slow melting to hydrate those root systems and help those trees activate as they're entering their growing season. So let's take a step back and think about what our forests really look like. On the left here, you'll see a map that shows the state with different forest types. So forest types are just developed based on the community of plants that grow together. And those plants grow together because they share specific needs for their environment. On the right, you'll see This is forested land across the whole state, and it shows those categories broken out in millions of acres. So you'll see very clearly that the largest and most common forest type that we have is maple, beech, and birch. And when you look at that New York State map, those are the darker green areas. So the majority of the Adirondacks and the majority of the Catskills, and even some presence in the southern tier there as well. And it's important to provide context to those reasons as to why certain species grow in certain areas. And they're really influenced by the ecology of the landscape. And so ecology, if not familiar, can seem maybe like an intimidating word. So eco, we're thinking about just our ecosystems, and ology is just the study of. So we're talking about the study of our forested ecosystems. I would love to hear from folks if you wanted to shout out any characteristics that you can think of that might exist in a forest, things that are there that we have to learn to understand and live and work with. I've got some clues here in the forms of pictures, but does anyone have anything they want to shout out in terms of characteristics of a forest? What makes up the ecology? Deer, thank you. Too many deer. That is certainly one. Um, Beyond a site characteristic, that is certainly an impact. And I guess in line with your comment about human population, we have a population issue with deer. Technically, that is something that we can change, although it doesn't often feel like it. Anybody else? All right, let's roll through them here. So the first one that I have is slope and aspect. The direction that a slope is facing is the aspect, and that will greatly influence how much light is received. Slopes and aspects can kind of modify microclimates and create little nooks and crannies to sort of diversify the landscape. But if you think about a northeast facing slope, they're directed away from the sun and receive less light, so they tend to be cooler and moist, while a southwest slope might be warmer and drier. So those characteristics will influence what grows there and what the forests look like. Elevation is another important one that we can't change. Tree species diversity is directly linked to this. I'm here in the northern Catskills. If we think about the tops of the Catskills at the highest elevation, those forests are typically spruce and fir. And moving down, you might run into more mixed northern hardwoods. And down on drier, like rocky ledges, you might see oak hickory. So big impacts there based on just where you're at elevation wise. And then climate. This shouldn't come as a surprise to us, but this is based on just the latitudinal gradient where we are, how close or how far from the ecosystem. Someone just called out fungal and mycelial networks. You're teeing me up for the next one. So those are what happens in the soil. And yes, absolutely. All of these processes that happen in the soil really dictate what can grow there. Our soils support all forested life. They're mixed up of organic matter, mineral particles, and they're also comprised of water and air, which is our next category. And thinking about water and air in the context of forest soils, in an undisturbed forest soil, the volume of air and water is roughly equal. And that's really important for soil functions, for the fungi, the bacteria, the insects, and the worms that make up all those biological processes. And compaction of soil, perhaps through heavy equipment, can reduce the pore spaces, and they can cause soil density, which reduces function. So just some baselines of, things that we all have to work with when we're out there in our woods. And so considering all those factors that we work with, that we're presented with, there are distinct stages that forests go through when they grow, no matter what's on the landscape. So from nothing to something is sort of what we have at the top here, which is called primary succession, just from bare rock, open land with no real plants to speak of, starting at the beginning. There are distinct stages that occur, and those look like the presence of annual plants emerging first, and then moving into more perennials like grasses or herbaceous perennials that die back every year. With the establishment of that baseline, other species will start to integrate, and those species could maybe have more shade tolerance. So what I mean by that is some species need full sun in order to germinate and to start their journey in growing. And other species like sugar maples actually require shade on the forest floor. So those are shade tolerant species. So that we start with our pioneer species and we move into that intermediate space. And then as our forests age and those shade tolerant species grow up into the forest canopy, we'll enter our mature forests. Once that landscape exists, disturbance can happen, and it does. And that's what causes what's called secondary succession. So something wipes the slate clean and that whole process starts again. So here's where we get into some more of those impacts that you all have been bringing up in the Q&A. So we have all these factors on the ground that influence our ecology. We have different stages where our forest growth may or may not be at. And then we have impacts that can happen to them. And so here's a few. A major impact of how our forests look are our management decisions. So the way the land that you might have bought or inherited was managed in the past can result in how it looks now, or the actions that you take now as a landowner or actions that are not taken are management decisions that continue to influence the way our forests look. Herbivory is a huge one. So that brings us back to the deer. Deer are in high population, and we've been generating some data based on how our forests may or may not be regenerating ourselves to document that their population are out of sync with the landscape. And deer are a keystone species. They have the ability to change not only their habitat, but the habitat around them and for others. So the way that they eat seedlings and saplings can alter the structure and composition of a forest long term. Pests and diseases is another big one. Many of us are becoming more and more familiar with this through things like emerald ash borer or hemlock woolly adelgid, or maybe even you might know about jumping worm in your forest floors. So these factors also can really influence and change our forest's appearance and their function based on what species your woods are comprised of. And then climate change, as we've already talked about a little bit, these changes in temperature and rainfall patterns are causing some species that are more specific in their needs to start to die out, and the ones that are maybe a little more generalized to continue to grow and take over. And that often goes hand in hand with some of our non-native and invasive species gaining dominance in our forests. So let's shift away from the negatives and start talking about the positives a little bit. We talk about forest health all the time. It's important to understand what that really means. And if you could sum it up into one word, it would be diversity, for me anyway. So there are a couple different factors that are important to keep in mind when you're trying to evaluate the health of a woods. There's this concept known as the green lie. If you see green, it must be good. So if the woods are there and they're growing, must be healthy, things must be okay. Unfortunately, that is not the case, or is typically not the case. So when we're thinking about forest health and diversity, what exactly do we mean by that? Here's a couple categories. This is a screenshot from a tool that we developed in partnership with CCE Onondaga and the Nature Conservancy a few years ago called the Forest Health Scorecard. This will be part of your follow-up packet. And it really helps to simplify what we're talking about when we say forest health. And it's created in a scorecard and a simple ranking system that helps a landowner, perhaps with the assistance of a professional, to really help evaluate their woods and see the things that are going well and the things that maybe could be improved on. So when we talk about diversity and health, we're thinking about forest diversity and composition. So that means species diversity. We just mentioned impacts to forest health in the forms of pests, such as emerald ash borer. If your woods were comprised mainly of ash trees, then your impacts are probably pretty extreme. But if you had those ash trees, say 20 years ago, and had the foresight to manage for emerald ash borer, maybe you would thin those woods and encourage different light regimens on the forest floor, and maybe put some tree tubes in to encourage some seedlings to grow into saplings and have a mixed presence of species on your property instead of just ash, if someone would have told us 10, 20 years ago. But now we know, so that's how we think about forest health. And forest structure is another really big component of that. And forest structure is looking vertically through the layers of a forest. We have our canopy, which is way up top, all the trees that are getting that prime sunlight. And then we have this mid-story layer, trees that are underneath the canopy. Maybe they're a little more shade tolerant and are happy to be there. Maybe they're sort of stuck there, but it creates that structure. And then we have our understory, our herbaceous plants on the forest floor, our seedlings that are germinating and starting to grow. And that structure really provides resilience through having diversity, and it really serves different users of the forest. Birds, for example, require different layers of the forest to be successful in having habitat and food. So making sure that our forests have that presence of these different layers can help. And we often are presented with woods that have a canopy and are maybe missing a mid-story and missing an understory, perhaps because of deer. And regeneration deserves its own category because that is really the landmark of forest health. Is that forest able to grow a new one? This is mainly influenced by the presence of deer, but other invasive species and jumping worms in the forest floor can help reduce or impact those native plants from regenerating and growing. And so healthy forests are important for many reasons, but healthy forests actually do increase carbon on the ground. So the larger a tree grows, the more carbon they lock in. The more healthy a tree is, the more vigorous their root system is to improve soil health and carbon in the soil. And as we discussed, our diverse forests are more resilient and less susceptible to pests. So here's the map I referred to a little bit ago that shows carbon numbers in New York State. So this map shows that we have 18.6 million acres of forests throughout the state, and that equates to 1.9 billion metric tons of carbon. And you'll see most of the state is very forested. We do have some gaps here, in the Finger Lakes region down in Long Island, but we see the majority of the carbon stored in the Adirondacks and the Catskills, which if you think back to that map of forest type from the beginning, you might remember that those forest types that exist primarily in those regions are those maple beech, those mixed hardwood forests. So they're doing really good work. Oops, let's go back. All right, so to start to put some of this into context, there's a lot of different factors, a lot of different elements to consider and juggle. And a really important process that, in our opinion, every landowner should engage with is forest management planning, for a number of reasons. First of all, it just helps you know what you have. It helps you understand why your woods look the way they do and what's out there. The main reason most people engage in forest management planning is to develop their own goals for themselves and their woods. This process can also help one understand potential products that might come from your woods. And that doesn't just mean timber, that can include carbon, it can include understory crops, it can include maple syrup. There's so much potential that exists in our woods, and you just really have to connect deeply with it to unlock it. And through this process, we always recommend working with a professional so you can take those goals and develop them into a plan. Typically, the next step of that process in working with a professional is to develop some data and get a baseline to understand and really capture where your forests are at in this point in time so you can see change in the future. And that plan is really a roadmap for you and your goals and your values. And then it's also important to recognize, and I think you'll see through the next few slides, that if you're managing with carbon in mind, you can typically meet many other goals and stay in line with other values that you might have for your woods. So what we do on the ground really matters. And it might be easy to think about this as, just trees are growing, more carbon is being sequestered and stored, and that might not always be the case. It's really not that simple. So I have two graphics here, two different squares on the screen. Think about these as an acre of your woods. On the left here, we have smaller, let's look at those circles as trees. So smaller trees growing sporadically throughout that acre. And on the right, we have different sized trees, much bigger typically than what we're seeing on the other side. And a way that foresters try and evaluate how much wood is on the ground is by using a basal area gauge to determine the basal area in a given acre. So that's calculating at 4.5 feet at diameter at breast height. If you cut all the trees off, you're calculating the volume, the area, the square feet that those stumps take up throughout an acre. So you might think, okay, there's a ton of small trees, maybe there's more volume there. But just to throw some quick numbers out of like what we might see when we're doing these calculations is smaller trees do not equate to the same area as larger trees. It's more simplified when you say it like that. But having mixed sizes of trees and larger trees is resulting in more mass, in more carbon sequestration and storage. And so we would prefer to try and encourage a forest to have that diversity and have different sized trees so more carbon can be locked in and on the ground. And so
Tracy,
in
I
a
just
very
wanted to
simple
interrupt for a second. Freda does have a comment to make on that map that we've just previously seen. So it does look like it may be a little bit outdated because we have seen a little bit of species composition change. So it does appear when we're out in the woods that some of our maple beech forests are transitioning over to oak. Would you like to speak to that?
just trying to figure out which map we're talking about, not the carbon
That one right
one.
there. Yeah, with the carbon
I think we're talking about this
or
one.
forest types, yes.
And these forest type maps are from 2017. So there may have been some shifts. And what she's pointing to is this concept of species migration due to shifting climates, which is something we're certainly seeing on the ground. There's a lot of projections, and to my knowledge, there hasn't been a whole lot of data or ability to ground truth those projections because trees move really slow. So you might be right in that some of those shifts are happening, but we're still seeing the majority of our forest types now look like maple, beech, and birch because those shifts just can't happen in a short time of year or a short time.
We also have another question or a comment here. This may be a naive question regarding forest composition. Why aren't there oak maple forests? Are those pairings of species just what happens?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's think about those trees and maybe the habitat to usually see them in, and we can connect them to their needs. So when I think about oaks, I think about more, I mean, it depends on the species of oak, but let's say red oak, for example. Those typically are able to, first of all, tolerate direct sunlight to the forest floor when they're regenerating. So they're what's called an early successional species or a mid-successional species, where sugar maples, for instance, require sun or require shade on the forest floor. And so those will come later in those stages of succession. Oaks like more dry soils, they can tolerate more dry sites, and sugar maples require more consistent moisture. So in terms of like slope and aspect, we might encounter oaks more on a southern dry ridge and where there's more light, and see more sugar maples on a cooler north or northeast facing slope where there's consistent moisture for them. So it just really comes down to species needs, and there are exceptions. Red maple, for example, I swear that's going to be the last tree that's left at the end of the world. It will tolerate a lot of different conditions. It's not nearly as picky as maybe a sugar maple is. So I hope that helps with your question. Okay, and then circling back over here to the presentation, I just wanted to share this very simplified version of a concept. So as trees are becoming successful and reaching up towards the canopy in this earlier stage of a forest, that's when the majority of sequestration happens. So pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into those trees as they grow. And typically, as forests mature and enter their older phases of growth, that's when mass storage occurs. So carbon is locked up in those trees' volume. But this is not always the case. As I said, really simplified way to look at this or think about it. Trees do not stop sequestering carbon as they age. So carbon sequestration still happens in that max storage phase. Look at the understory, you still see new trees growing up, mature trees are dying. So there's still both processes happening. And this graph might actually depict a vulnerable forest. It looks like a single species forest that's all grown up together and is in the same age. So ideally, what we would like to see is diversity in age and diversity in species. So we're encouraging both of these processes to happen together. All right, putting carbon as a management objective into a little more context, I just wanted to call out a couple great guides that we'll be including in the follow-up. So Healthy Forests for Our Future is a management guide written by the Nature Conservancy and another organization called the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS. And forest carbon, an essential natural solution for climate change, is another excellent guide created by UMass. And so I'm just going to call out some of the management objectives that they define in those guides. I guess before we get into this, I see another Q&A pop up from Anthony asking.
Yeah, I was also going to mention that there's a forest regeneration update webinar coming out soon. Is that right? For the forest regeneration plans.
Yeah, just to give our audience some context here, the question from Anthony was, can you comment on Governor Hochul's plan to add 30 million trees to New York State over the next 20 years or so? I think it's over the next 30 by 30 is the plan. Is the plan related to um, lost forest, far land to suburbia, or is it to enhance carbon sequestration? That's an interesting question, Anthony. Oh, Brittany's raising her hand. I think she might want to speak on this. Hey, Shane, can you allow Brittany to?
Actually, I think I just realized that I can't control the hand raises.
All right, I can. Hey, Brittany.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Brittany Winke. I'm a forest projects manager with the Nature Conservancy in New York. I wanted to just say about the about Governor Hochul's recent call for planting millions of trees and the reforestation plan that is coming out of that. It's in development right now, and so where are the trees going to be planted? What are the goals? What are the metrics we're going to use to monitor success? All of those are still in development right now. So it's a great question, but I don't think we have the answer quite yet because we are deciding what the answers are.
Keeping you on the hook there. Follow along as that plan develops to learn more. But it's a great point. There's a lot of actions that are happening on a state level that could help enhance or influence how our forests look over the coming years. And I'd urge you all, as residents perhaps of New York State, to engage in those processes. There's typically public commenting periods that are associated with all these plans. So we as residents and taxpayers can make sure we are heard. Okay, calling out, like I said, a few management practices that align with managing for carbon, typically called climate smart forestry management practices. So this first one might feel obvious, protect our forests. We want to keep our forested land as forested land. But a bit beyond that, things that we'd like to avoid are parcelization and fragmentation. So you can see those depictions here, where parcelization is a large area of land that gets broken out into smaller and smaller pieces, meaning that there are many more landowners and land managers that can just really alter maybe the path a forest was taking for better or worse. And then the other thing you see here in the slide is fragmentation. So that's where there are sections of forest removed and these forested lands become disjointed. And while they're disconnected, they start to lose some of their ecological processes. They gain vulnerability. Grow new trees and forests. So in addition to keeping our forested habitats as forested habitats, we can look for opportunities to find new space to add trees to the landscape. So you'll see a shot here. This is an organization that works down in Pennsylvania and does fantastic work. They're adding a buffer to a site in the form of woody plants. And you'll see they've got their tree tubes on to make sure that the deer don't eat all of their hard work. And then reducing stressors. This is a really important one. You can take all the actions that you think are correct for you in your woods But if you have a high presence of invasive species, if you have a high presence of deer browse, you may not be able to achieve your goals based on those impacts. So just a couple photos to call out here. You'll see this shot with on the left with a couple people in it. That's me and Shane and a couple other members of our team putting up a deer exclosure in a patch clear cut where we were attempting to diversify the species and the age class of our forests. We needed to make sure that something grew there, so we had to put a fence up to protect it. Up on the top of the screen, you'll see us looking down a deer exclosure fence that was maybe 10 or 15 years old at this point. And on the right side is all the vegetation in, and on the left really depicts the lack of vegetation outside. And the other image there is a picture of a forest in Westchester County with a complete understory of Japanese barberry. So really lacking diversity and resilience as this forest is not able to regenerate itself. And then managing those forests. So a couple different strategies here, and these all do not have to be thought of independently. These different practices, such as growing an old forest, establishing some reserves, creating gaps like the one you see in this picture to promote regeneration, or planning to retain more carbon in a thinning, are all different management strategies that can happen independently or incorporated in a management plan, all occurring on the same forested property, just in different sections. So a lot of ways that we can work towards a healthy forest, a forest that aligns with our goals, while thinking about and managing for carbon. And sort of as a tee up to upcoming webinars, I just wanted to talk a little bit about carbon credits and just a little bit about what's happening on the landscape as we close out our hour here. So in the graphic here, you'll see, CO2 sequestration from forests being cycled into industry. So there are some regulatory actions that are occurring where industries are, hopefully trying to reduce their emissions, but maybe have reduced as much as they can and need to or want to buy carbon credits to offset what they're putting out. So showing that they're engaging and paying for sequestration as they're also engaging in emissions. And these projects are typically framed around these three different actions that you see here on the slide: improve forest management, afforestation, and avoided conversion, which are the same strategies we just outlined for the way we can manage our woods for carbon. And so while these carbon offset projects have been occurring for some time now, they've mainly been accessible to larger industry and large-scale landowners. So there have been great efforts taken by different organizations to create forest carbon programs that are more accessible to smaller scale landowners. We've called out 4 on the slide here. Only 3 are functioning, and these are currently the 3 options that exist in this region. Large landowners have already been enrolling, but as I said, there have been efforts to reduce the acreage requirements to make these programs accessible for small scale landowners. And we have just a quick chart here that calls out just some similarities and differences. So the NCX one is the one that is defunct, it's no longer functioning. You can see their project duration was only 1 year. It wasn't very practical to implement. So the other 3 that we have are the Family Forest Carbon Program run by the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy, Forest Carbon Works, and Core Carbon. And if you look at minimum acreage, you'll see around 30 to 40. I do know that the Nature Conservancy is working on getting their minimum acreage down to 15. And then there's different project durations, and they span from 20 to 40 years. When looking at revenue, Just as an individual going to these three different organizations' websites, there's not a whole lot of transparency with Forest Carbon Works and Core Carbon. You really have to engage with them before you can start to get at potential revenue. But the Nature Conservancy provides some good transparency here that shows a range of $200 to $360 per acre over the course of that 20-year plan. And I think it's also really important to note that TNC staff work directly with the landowner and establish a management plan for all the lands they work with.
I think this might be a good time to revisit Freda's comment early on, asking about the different programs. I think us as landowners should be doing our own due diligence and take some time to research some of these programs. The comment was, could you please speak to some of the publicly advertised programs being offered to forest owners, such as the Family Forest Carbon offered through Facebook? Are they a wise commitment for forest owners? Are they taking advantage? And I think that comes down to doing some research, but we can say that the Family Forest Carbon program was listed on your sheet there on that slide, right?
Yes, yeah, thanks for bringing that back around to that initial question. And yes, I would encourage that participant to join in for the following webinars where, we'll dive a little bit more into this. So I'll just skip to my next slide that shows our upcoming schedule here. So the next webinar happens on November 6th and is talking more about forest carbon. That's like a forest carbon 101. And then webinar 3 is directly about enrolling in forest carbon markets. So while we will be sending you follow-up resources for you to look through, I would encourage you to join back in for those follow-ups to learn more specifics about those programs.
So we do have a couple comments and questions.
Great.
Since we're on the carbon sequestration right now with the carbon programs, I thought we would visit Jono's question here.
Sure.
With respect to carbon sequestration in dead wood, what's the current thinking on burning wood for heat, campfires, etc.?
Got it. Thanks for that question, Jono. When you think just simply about the process that occurs when you burn wood, it is releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So it's sort of undoing the sequestration that happens. I will say, that is not the only consideration for choosing to burn firewood. Sourcing firewood from your woods or woods nearby can really help active landowners engage in sustainable forest management through actions like timber stand improvements, so intentional cuts to improve the health of your forests, with that wood being a byproduct. And if, selling or using that firewood as a byproduct of that action is what creates that action to happen, then I think, those different costs and benefits need to be weighed. Similarly, if burning wood helps reduce your dependence on fossil fuels, that just might be another consideration for that shift. So I think if you asked a lot of people if you had to burn oil for heat or wood for heat, they both release carbon dioxide, but burning that wood isn't, it just might help you engage with your local ecology. And I do see there was a question about one of my previous slides here. Oh.
Yeah, could the speaker say a few sentences on each of the 4 points on forest management? Examples are, what is grow old forests? What does it mean to create gaps to promote, and etc.?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. So grow old forests is exactly what it sounds like. It's, maybe choosing an area of woods that you're just letting mature without a lot of interaction or engagement. That is a strategy that helps with that mass carbon storage. So old forests have a ton of carbon locked up in them, and it's a good strategy to try and help that remain or maintain, at least in some components of your woods. The other call out was creating gaps to promote regeneration. So we talked a little bit about how light levels influence different species that grow. And often what we have here in the Northeast is what's called an even-aged mature forest. So our forests have grown to maturity, and they've all grown up at the same time as a result of past management activities, and that can create some vulnerabilities. So mixing up the age diversity can be done through opening up patches in the forest. So, a small patch cut can be a half acre or an acre or even less or more, and just creates a different sort of habitat for new species to grow and to have a different age class present in your woods. I did want to just get back over to the discussion questions and recognize that we are a little bit over time here. I really appreciate all of the engagement that you all have had during this presentation. And if anyone can stick around, I'm happy to stay for a few more minutes just to discuss, some of these points. We would love to hear more from the participants. And we'll just start, with the first one. Do you have goals for you and your woodlands? Is this something you're thinking about? Have you developed a management plan? Is that kind of in your head or is that on paper? You can just raise your hand if you want to come off, and you're also welcome to speak about any barriers that you might have in achieving those goals, or in general, any other topics you might want to engage with in the future. All right, I've got one. Prida, you can speak now, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. So my family, excuse me, has owned a large area of forest in the southern tier for over 40 years. And I've prevented any logging. But my hopes for the forest growing older and staying healthy have been interfered with by many, if not all, of the factors you have discussed today. So I don't have to go over them. The challenge, the greatest challenge, is currently, because of all these factors, increasing loads of invasives and particularly watching what was healthy beech become diseased and the spread of the root sprouts. So the challenge, I'm now older and I have learned all the proper things to do, but maintaining 80 plus acres with increasing invasives is really impossible single-handed, even if I were younger. And the cost of hiring people to do it is beyond, beyond what a retired person can manage. Which is why I have investigated some of the forest sequestration programs and even tried to hire private foresters to only take out diseased trees, and not to make money, but any money going into control of invasives, but have found honesty lacking and high grading is what just about everybody's trying to do. So what I'm asking is specifically, how can private people who can't do all this work themselves, specifically in costly things like invasive removal and control and things like deer exclusion fences. What I assume you will probably go into some of this in the future webinars, but I want to put it out there that even those of us who've taken the trouble to educate ourselves and do the right thing are facing financial and physical roadblocks to that. Even, even permits to remove excess deer.
Yeah. Oh, geez. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'll just say, if nothing else, at least know that you're not in it alone. You're explaining a similar situation and circumstance that many of us are in and have to learn how to deal with. And I commend you and all the other landowners who work so hard to educate themselves and do the right thing by their woods, but then still get, surprised with an impact or an obstacle. And so funding these activities is certainly a huge barrier to landowners. I'll mention two opportunities that you might be able to engage with. So New York State has a funding program called Regenerate New York. Any landowner in New York State who has a forest or a management plan can apply. And those projects, those category projects are invasive species removal, forest regeneration, and controlling deer through fencing or other strategies like tubing. So that might be of interest to you or other folks on the call. And also, as you learn more about these forest carbon programs, as you engage in our webinars, you might find that one of those programs might be a good fit for you and your woods to get some incentive payments that you could put back into your management. I saw one other hand up. Peter, I think you went down, but I'm going to give you the option to talk if you'd like to.
I was just going to mention the Regenerate New York grant program in response to the last comment, which very articulately expressed all the frustrations and challenges for landowners trying to do this. But it is a pretty generous grant program, and it will pay up to 75% of the cost of doing work. So it's a very meaningful option for people to explore.
Have you engaged with that before, Peter?
I have an application pending currently.
You
so
do? Okay, we'll keep our fingers crossed for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for expanding on that point. And I'm hoping with all of these statewide plans that we're seeing about aiming to increase the amount of forested habitat and forest health, I'm hoping that we're going to start to see more and more funding streams to support landowners. We know that New York State's forests are held in the majority by private forested landowners. So we need to figure out how to support those landowners who are stewarding this really important resource. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions, just getting some nice notes from people. I really appreciate that. And I just wanted to thank you all for spending some time with us today. And we hope to see you at the next one, November 6th. Thanks, everyone.